While I do agree that transformations or any form of change need to have a start and an end, my general thesis for transformation is that it's not an event. It's not about a start or a finish. It's about a continuum. And when I think of a continuum, I think of a continuum of capability building, which I will circle back to, and value delivery. A lot of the time we focus on the value delivery side, which is great. You know, we have objectives that we got to meet. We have deadlines, we have tasks, we have a plan, and that's great. But actually the question is, are you different as an organization, as an individual, as a collective? Are you different and better prepared for change than you were when you went into the transformation? Because the reality is we're always evolving, we're always changing. And so I like to think of a transformation as a continuum where it's really observing how am I building the right capabilities to be able to do this better, faster next time, but also stop value leakage. I've heard an interesting view, and I think I like it actually, where people talk about transformation and change as a state of unfreezing and refreezing. I like that idea. This is the state today. For me to change it or respond to an external force or something internally, it doesn't really matter what's driving it. I gotta unfreeze, change the state, and then refreeze, which is a great way to think of transformation. But it's a very healthy balance because, you know, if you cook, for example, and you think about roasting a chicken, it says put it in the oven for like 3 hours at 200 degrees. You cranking it up to 300 degrees to make it faster will actually ruin or burn the food, right? So it's about understanding that there's a delicate effort required to unfreeze values, beliefs, behaviors, culture, remold that, and then refreeze that state. And that's not about project timelines. That's not about a start and a finish. That's about thinking through how this evolves, I guess, from a collective perspective, and driving a shared ownership is my perspective on that. I think self-awareness is critical to any form of change or transformation. Any form of change or transformation. And actually, I'll give you a good analogy. I think it was Theodore Levite, HBS professor, that wrote about this, the railway industry in the US. I think it was the 1930s or 40s. I mean, he wrote about this in the 60s, but the thesis was around the death of the railway industries. And he argued that they didn't die as an industry because the transportation industry was dying. No, it's because their identity was welded to how they delivered value. As in, I help facilitate movement of people from A to B on trains, but actually they stepped away from what value they delivered, which was transportation. You're not a railway company, you're a transportation company. That's self-awareness. And so positioning that in the minds of the core of any transformation is super critical, is actually why are you changing? And Amboise touched on this, you know, aligning on visions and priorities and all that good stuff, and reframing that mindset, I think is super critical. The why that drives it is super important. I think transformation happens not in the how of what you do, it's in the why, and it's in the what you deliver. So that's the exact reason why I push back on the idea of transformation. It anchors the change to a solution or an operating model when you have that idea of the how. Whereas if you have the idea of the what I'm doing, it anchors it into something a lot more sustainable and something that builds the core competency and capability of the organization, of the individuals, of the teams to be able to respond effectively to change. And there's a big distinction there, in my opinion. I mean, there's always going to be a challenge when you think about taking things that are big topics, right, or big ideas or big constructs and breaking it down. But for sure, I think the first thing when you're trying to mobilize or drive teams on a transformation journey it has to be, what does it mean for me on a day-to-day? Clarity is everything. You have to think very clearly. People have to be able to operate very clearly. So take an example of Monday morning. What does it mean when you tell me that I now need to work in an agile way? What does it mean for me on a Monday morning? What decisions can't I make anymore? And what decisions can I make, right? How do I structure the governance and the approach to solutioning or delivering of a service or a product? Breaking it down is by far one of the critical elements in terms of mobilizing teams along the axis of transformation. I'm going to answer that question in two parts. I think the first part that I want to lean into is data. Let's be data driven, because I think it ties in with the previous question around building teams and mobilizing teams for a transformation journey. Right? So research shows that 1 in 5 transformation programs stop funding a change that is no longer delivering on the desired effect. 1 in 5, right? So that's like 80%, that's basically saying 80% of transformations that keep getting funded are destroying value, but yet we keep doing it. Now there's several phenomena here, right? You can think of loss aversion theory, right? Which says that we feel the pain of loss more so, I think twice as much, more so than the pain of gain. You can think of sunk cost fallacy, which is that I've already spent so much money on this, why stop now? But then there's also the ego perspective, right? Which is a lot of times rooted in fear, because it's our self-esteem, it's how we measure our success, et cetera, et cetera. It's super important to acknowledge these things, but actually it's super important to also lean back to not just the outcomes, but the becoming as well. The notion of capability building. The way to combat that fear, which is natural in any change or transformation, is, I'm going to steal from Kobe Bryant, right, who's a great basketball player. And he said, I'm not responsible for outcomes. I'm only responsible for the process. So I know that the process says I got to take 1,000 shots a day. And through that, the average person that trains and takes 1,000 shots a day is likely to have a shooting percentage average over the season of X. For me, it's about focusing on what's in your control, because you can't be responsible always for the outcomes of things. You don't know what geopolitical forces, what challenges, what changes, what difficulties, what adjustments will need to be made. That's part of the world that we live in. That's part of building teams. That's part of delivering value to your customers. I think the best way to fight the fears that rise when you think of driving transformation, change is inevitable. That's going to happen even while you've got a plan. But you can be in control of the process, and you can be rigorous about it and follow the right steps. And by doing that, you often tend to get the right outcomes. I think it's one part of it. But I think the other part is, how have you been able to embody holistically in the capability building mindset? Is there more maturity in that capability? It's not just, a process is just one element of a capability. So that's why I'm saying yes, but it's not all of it, right? When you think about capability building, you think about people, you think about process, you think about organization, you think about information, you think about technology and tools. So there's multiple different parts here. Rigorously following the process is not just the only thing that allows you to win. It's one element of it, but it's about holistically understanding, how is this capability maturing, right? And how is it developing? For me, the first thing has to be being clear on the objective and the what, not the how, of what the transformation is intended to achieve. That is the first thing, right? So is it implementing a digital transformation, digital solution is not an objective, right? That's a means to an end. The end has to be, is it to improve cycle times? Is it to improve decision making or faster decision? Is it to reduce the cost to serve? These are measurable, clear objectives. And I think leaning into something that I discussed with Amboss in the earlier part of this series, he pressed on about the need of having clear, measurable objectives. Quantifiable was the word he actually used. And that fits in with a narrative of a start to end. Start to end of the objective, not of the transformation. So having a clear perspective on that is super paramount for leaders. But then communicating it, right? Being effective at communication is everything. The ability to be able to take complex ideas, perspectives, and break it down and make it relevant for the people digesting it. Because it's one thing to take it and break it down, but if it's not relevant for the people digesting it, that's another challenge in itself, right? I've worked with CEOs who will articulate a 20-page strategy really succinctly, and they're very clear and they're, super polished about it. But then you go down to the next level of the organization, first or second level give you 5, 6, 7, maybe in some cases 20 different responses to what the strategy is. That's not a cascaded strategy. And as Amboss referenced, right, getting alignment at that top level is so critical for any successful transformation. So it's clarity and rigor in the objective, but acknowledging that that's not the end of the transformation. I think this is a super important point that I need to hone in on, is defining an objective that has a start and an end is not the end of a transformation. It is a phase in transforming. The end of a transformation is the beginning of the transformation, right? It's a continuum. But what you do is you're measuring that in each cycle that we go into, we're better, we're faster, we're more efficient, we're embodying our ability to respond to external changes. So that's the second thing. And I would probably say the last thing is empowerment, because people deliver the change at the end of the day. Being clear on roles. Role clarity is so important in delivering on transformation objectives, right? When I see and design work packages with clients, we think about sometimes splitting big projects into different work streams where you have clarity on owners. When you think about a change journey, right? Empowering change champions, change owners, the people who become the ambassadors for that. Start with value. What exactly we're trying to get out of this. Don't talk to me about digital, or don't talk to me about a solution. Those things are a means, they're not the end. So what's the value we're trying to extract here? Remember what I said. When I think of transformation, there are two things that need to be true. The first thing is capability building. I need to come out strong and better, faster. And the second one is value delivery. What value am I delivering on? So I'm either delivering new value or stopping destruction of existing value, right? So value first. The second one is ownership. I think clarity of ownership is super important. Be clear who's doing what, and make it simple, make it plain. And within that sort of clarity is also communication. And perhaps I would say, think of any change as a system. The same way you have your respiratory system, your digestive system, everything needs to work together. It's an ecosystem. It needs to work together. So ensuring that all parts are talking to each other, or have reference points, have the right oversight and governance, and are communicating effectively is super critical for any transformation journey.